Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to Tudor England, to the reign of the Tudors, to the crowded towns, muddy villages, and the great houses of that distant age. And we are going to look at something that we rarely stop to think about, the work that people did, and in particular, the very worst of it. So, before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from in the world and what time it is. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find it comforting to imagine all of us lying awake in the dark together and drifting back through the centuries. Also, tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure at all. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some sweet background hum, and get comfortable, because we have a long and gentle journey ahead of us tonight, back through the years to a world of hard labor and curious old trades. You do not need to remember any of it. Now, let's begin. For the Tudor world ran on human labor, on the toil of countless ordinary people doing countless ordinary jobs, and some of those jobs were so hard, so unpleasant, so genuinely grim, that we can scarcely imagine anyone doing them at all. And yet people did them, day after day, because the work had to be done, and because they had little choice. And that is what we are going to wander through tonight, gently and without alarm. The worst jobs in Tudor England, the ones you would surely reject if you could. Have you ever wondered what the very worst jobs in Tudor England actually were? The ones that dealt with the dirt and the waste and the grim necessities that every society must somehow manage. Have you ever wondered who did the unpleasant work that kept the Tudor world running, and what their days were like, and how they endured it? Have you ever wondered what strange and difficult trades filled that vanished world, trades that have long since disappeared? These are the things we are going to drift through tonight, slowly, in the dark, the whole curious catalogue of the worst jobs in Tudor England. So settle back, let your eyes grow heavy, and feel grateful perhaps for your own comfortable life, as we travel together to an age of hard and humble toil. Let us begin, gently, with the world of work itself, with what labour meant in the Tudor age. To understand the worst jobs of Tudor England, we have first to understand the world of work in which they existed, a world utterly different from our own, in which nearly all labour was hard, physical, and unrelenting, and in which the comforts and protections we now take for granted simply did not exist. For the Tudor world ran entirely on human muscle and human toil, and the ease and safety of modern work would have been unimaginable to the people of that age, whose working lives were, by our standards, extraordinarily hard. There were, in the Tudor world, none of the machines that now do so much of our heavy and unpleasant work, none of the engines and devices that spare us the hardest labour. Everything that needed doing had to be done by hand, by the physical effort of human beings, or with the help of animals. And this meant that work was overwhelmingly physical, demanding real bodily effort and endurance. The lifting and the carrying, the digging and the hauling, the endless manual labour of a world without machines, fell upon the backs and arms of ordinary people, whose working lives were filled with a physical toil that we can scarcely imagine. To work, in the Tudor age, was very often to labour hard with one's body, hour after hour, day after day. There were, too, none of the protections and comforts that now make even hard work bearable and safe. None of the safety measures, the reasonable hours, the protective equipment, the rights and regulations that we now expect. Work could be dangerous, and there was little to protect the worker from its dangers. Work could be long, stretching from dawn to dusk and beyond, with little rest. Work could be done in the worst of conditions, in cold and wet and filth and heat, with no relief. The Tudor worker laboured without the protections we now take for granted, exposed to the dangers and hardships of the work in a way that would horrify us, enduring conditions that no modern worker would accept. The hardness of Tudor work was made harder still by the utter absence of protection, and there was, for most people, little choice in the matter. For the ordinary person had to work to survive, had to take whatever labor was available, however hard or unpleasant, because the alternative was destitution. There was no safety net, no support for those who could not or would not work, and so people did what they had to do, took the jobs that were to be had, endured the hardship because they had no other option. This lack of choice is essential to understanding the worst jobs of the age, for people did not do them by preference but by necessity, because they needed to eat and to live, and these grim trades were the means by which they survived. The worst jobs were done because they had to be done, by people who had little choice but to do them. Within this hard world of labour, there existed a whole range of jobs, from the relatively comfortable to the truly grim, and it is the grimmest of them that we shall explore tonight, the jobs that dealt with the dirt and the waste, and the dangers that every society produces and must somehow manage. These were the jobs at the very bottom, the hardest and most unpleasant of all, done by those who had the least choice, and they reveal the harder underside of the Tudor world, the grim necessities on which even that glittering age depended. Let us wander now through these worst of jobs, gently and with respect, marvelling at what people endured, and grateful perhaps for our own easier lives. Let that sense of the hard world of Tudor labour settle softly in the dark. We turn now to what may be the very worst job of all, the grim work of the gong farmer. Let us begin with what many would consider the very worst job in all of Tudor England, a job so unpleasant that its very name has become a byword for grim and dirty work, the gong farmer. For the gong farmer had the unenviable task of dealing with the human waste that every town and household produced, the emptying and cleaning of the pits and privies where that waste collected, and it is hard to imagine a less pleasant way to earn one's living. We shall treat it gently and without dwelling on the details, but it deserves its place at the head of our grim catalogue. The problem that the gong farmer solved was a real and pressing one, for the towns and houses of Tudor England had no modern sanitation, and the waste of the population collected in pits and cesspits that had, from time, to be emptied. These pits filled up over time, and when they were full, someone had to empty them, to remove the accumulated waste and carry it away, and this grim task fell to the gong farmer. It was work that had to be done, for the pits could not simply be left to overflow, and so, unpleasant as it was, the gong farmer performed a genuinely necessary service, dealing with the waste that the town produced and that no one else would touch. The work was grim, but it was essential to the functioning of the town. The work was performed, understandably, at night, when the streets were empty and the unpleasantness could be managed away from the public eye. The gong farmer worked in the darkness, emptying the pits by hand and carrying the waste away to be disposed of beyond the town, a labour carried out in the small hours while the rest of the world slept. This nighttime working was part of the peculiar character of the job, the gong farmer moving through the dark and sleeping town about his grim business, a figure of the night engaged in work that the daylight world preferred not to see. It was solitary, nocturnal, and deeply unpleasant, a job done in the dark in every sense. The work was not only unpleasant but genuinely dangerous, for the confined pits could contain harmful gases, and the gong farmer faced real hazards in his labour, risks to his health and even his life. The dangers of the work were serious, and the gong farmer laboured not only amid great unpleasantness, but amid real peril, the confined and noxious spaces posing genuine threats to those who worked in them. This danger was one of the reasons the work was so ill-regarded and so avoided, for it was not merely disgusting, but hazardous, a job that could harm as well as revolt. The gong farmer earned his living at real risk to himself, in one of the most dangerous as well as most unpleasant of trades. Yet there was one compensation, for precisely because the work was so unpleasant, and so few would do it, the gong farmer could command relatively good pay, earning more for his grim labour than many workers in less unpleasant trades. The very awfulness of the job meant that those who did it could demand a decent wage, for the work had to be done, and few were willing to do it, giving the gong farmer a certain bargaining power. This is a recurring theme in the worst jobs, that the most unpleasant work sometimes paid better precisely because it was so unpleasant, a grim compensation for a grim task. The gong farmer endured the worst of jobs, but he was, at least, somewhat better paid for it than one might expect. A small mercy in a hard trade. Let that picture of the gong farmer settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a job that dealt with similar matters but in the most exalted of settings, the groom of the stool. Having considered the lowly gong farmer, we turn now to a job that dealt with related matters but in an utterly different setting, at the very summit of society, in the intimate service of the king himself. This was the groom of the stool, and it offers one of the most surprising twists in the whole story of Tudor work. For although its duties might seem among the most demeaning imaginable, it was in fact one of the most coveted and powerful positions in the entire royal court. We shall consider this curious paradox gently and with tact. The basic duty of the groom of the stool was to attend the king in his most private moments, to assist him at his close stool, which was the royal lavatory, and to manage the intimate arrangements of the king's bodily needs. On the face of it, this seems a most undignified role, a servant charged with the most personal and private of attendances, and we might expect it to have been a lowly and avoided position. Yet the reality was quite the opposite, and understanding why reveals a great deal about how the Tudor court actually worked. The role, intimate and personal as it was, carried a significance that far outweighed the apparent indignity of its duties. The key to the paradox lay in the matter of access, for in the Tudor court, closeness to the king was the source of all power and influence, and the groom of the stool enjoyed the most intimate access of all. He was with the king in his most private moments, attended him personally and constantly, and had the king's ear in a way that few others could match. This intimate access made the groom of the stool a figure of real power and influence, a trusted confidant who could speak with the king privately, carry his wishes, and wield influence on his behalf. The very intimacy that might seem demeaning was in fact the source of the position's great value, for it placed the holder closer to the king than almost anyone else at court. As a result, the position of groom of the stool was held not by lowly servants but by gentlemen of good family, trusted courtiers who valued the access and influence it provided, and it became one of the most sought-after positions in the royal household. Men of standing competed for the role, prized it, and used it to build their power and fortune, for it was understood to be a path to royal favour and influence. The groom of the stool was often among the most powerful men at court, a key figure in the intimate world of the royal household, his apparently humble duties belying his very real importance. The position that dealt with the king's most private needs was, paradoxically, a prize coveted by ambitious gentlemen. This curious paradox, that a role dealing with such intimate and seemingly demeaning matters should be so coveted and powerful, reveals much about the peculiar workings of the Tudor court, where access and intimacy meant everything, and where proximity to the king outweighed all considerations of apparent dignity. It reminds us that the value of a job in that world was not always what it might seem, that the apparently lowly could in fact be exalted, and that the strange logic of the court could turn our expectations upside down. The groom of the stool, attending the king in his most private moments, was no lowly drudge but a powerful courtier, and his curious position stands as one of the great surprises in the story of Tudor work. Let that curious paradox settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a genuinely hard and unpleasant trade, the work of the tanner. We turn now to one of the essential but deeply unpleasant trades of the Tudor world, a craft that produced something vital to everyday life, but did so through a process so foul-smelling and disagreeable that its workers were often kept at the very edge of the town, avoided by their neighbours. the tanner, who turned raw animal hides into the leather on which so much of Tudor life depended. We shall treat the details gently, but the tanner's trade deserves its place among the worst of jobs. The tanner's work was essential, for leather was one of the most important materials of the age, used for shoes and clothing, for harness and saddlery, for countless everyday objects, and someone had to produce it from the raw hides of animals. The turning of those raw hides into usable leather was the tanner's craft, a skilled and necessary trade that supplied a material without which Tudor life could hardly have functioned. In this sense, the tanner was a valued craftsman, producing something genuinely important, and his skill was real and his product essential. The trade was necessary, and the tanner performed a genuine service to his community. But the process by which leather was made was long, laborious, and extremely unpleasant, involving the treatment of the raw hides with a variety of substances over a lengthy period, in a way that produced powerful and offensive smells. The various stages of preparing and treating the hides required unpleasant materials and produced a foul stench that hung about the tannery and everything near it. We shall not dwell on the particulars, but the tanning process was notoriously malodorous, one of the smelliest of all trades, and the tanner and his workplace carried an odour that made them thoroughly disagreeable to be near. The making of leather was a smelly and unpleasant business, however valuable its product. Because of the offensive smells, tanneries were often located at the edges of towns, away from where people lived, banished to the margins, so that their stench would trouble the community as little as possible. The tanner and his trade were kept at a distance, relegated to the outskirts, a spatial marginalization that reflected the unpleasantness of the work. This placement at the edge of things was characteristic of the noxious trades, pushed to the margins where their offensiveness could be contained, and the tanner worked in this marginal world, essential yet kept apart, valued for his product, but avoided for his smell. The geography of the town itself reflected the low regard in which the smelly trades were held. The tanner thus occupied a curious position, a skilled craftsman, producing an essential material, yet working in one of the most unpleasant of all trades, avoided and marginalized because of the foul nature of his work. His was a hard and disagreeable job, laborious and malodorous, conducted at the edge of society, and yet it was genuinely necessary, one of the essential trades on which the material life of the age depended. There is something to respect in the tanner's craft, the skilled production of a vital material through a difficult and unpleasant process, and something to pity in his marginalization, kept apart because of the very work that served his community. The tanner endured one of the worst of jobs in the service of one of the most essential of trades. Let that picture of the tanner settle gently in the dark. We turn now to another trade that relied on unpleasant substances, the work of the fuller. We come now to a trade that was central to the making of cloth, one of the great industries of Tudor England, but that relied upon a substance so unpleasant that the job has become notorious. The fuller, whose task was to clean and thicken woolen cloth, and who did so using, among other things, a substance we would find most disagreeable. We shall approach it with tact, but the fuller's trade earns its place in our catalogue of grim work. The fuller's work was an essential stage in the production of woolen cloth, which was one of the most important products of the Tudor economy, the backbone of English trade and industry. After the cloth was woven, it had to be cleaned of the oils and dirt it contained, and thickened into a denser, more useful fabric. And this was the fuller's task, a necessary stage in turning raw woven wool into finished cloth. Without fulling, the cloth could not be properly finished, and so the fuller performed a genuinely important role in the great woolen industry on which so much of England's wealth depended. His trade was essential to the making of the cloth that clothed the nation and enriched its merchants. The unpleasant part of the fuller's work lay in the substances used to clean the cloth, for the cleaning process traditionally relied upon stale urine, which was collected and used for its cleaning properties in treating the wool. This substance was gathered and used in the fulling process, its properties genuinely useful for cleaning the cloth, however disagreeable the material itself. We shall not dwell on the details, but the fuller worked with this unpleasant substance as a matter of course, handling it and using it in his trade, a necessary, if thoroughly disagreeable part of the work. The cleaning of the cloth depended on this humble and unpleasant material, and the fuller's hands were much in it. The work itself was also physically laborious, for the cloth had to be worked and pounded and trodden in the cleaning mixture, a hard physical labour that was sometimes done by treading the cloth underfoot in the mixture. This treading of the cloth, working it with the feet in the unpleasant liquid, was one of the traditional methods, a laborious and disagreeable task that combined physical effort with the handling of the foul substance. The fuller laboured physically in his unpleasant materials, working the cloth by hand and foot, a hard and dirty job that demanded real effort as well as a strong stomach. It was labour of the most disagreeable kind, physically demanding and thoroughly unpleasant. The fuller thus performed an essential service in the great cloth industry, but did so through a trade that combined hard physical labour with the handling of a most unpleasant substance, earning his place among the grimmer occupations of the age. His work was necessary and valuable, a vital stage in the production of the cloth on which England's prosperity rested, and yet it was disagreeable in the extreme, laborious and malodorous, and dependent on materials we would shrink from. The fuller, like so many of the workers in our catalogue, did essential work through unpleasant means, enduring the disagreeable realities of his trade in the service of a vital industry. Let that picture of the fuller settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a trade coloured, quite literally, by its unpleasant materials, the work of the dyer. Having considered the making and cleaning of cloth, we turn now to its colouring, to the trade of the dyer, and in particular to those who worked with one of the most important, but most unpleasant of the dyes, the blue dye, made from the woad plant. For the colouring of cloth was another essential stage in its production, but it too could be a disagreeable business, and the woad dyer in particular laboured amid smells and substances that earn the trade its place in our catalogue. The dyeing of cloth was an important craft, for the woven and fulled cloth had to be coloured to make the finished fabrics that people wanted, and the dyer's skill in producing and applying colours was a valued part of the cloth industry. Among the most important colours was blue, and one of the chief sources of blue dye was the woad plant, which was processed to produce the dye and was widely used for colouring cloth. The woad dyer specialised in this blue dye, producing and applying it to colour the cloth, a skilled trade that supplied one of the most popular and important of colours. The work was skilled and the product valued, for blue was a colour much in demand. The unpleasantness of the woad dyer's trade lay in the process of preparing the woad, which involved fermenting and treating the plant material in a way that produced a truly powerful and offensive smell. The processing of woad into usable dye was a notoriously malodorous business, the fermentation producing a stench that was among the worst of any trade, so bad that it, like tanning, was often pushed to the margins or subject to restrictions. We shall not dwell on the particulars, but the smell of the woad dyeing process was legendary in its awfulness, and the dyer who worked with it laboured amid an odour that made the trade thoroughly disagreeable. The producing of the beautiful blue colour depended on a most foul-smelling process. The dyer's work was also physically demanding and messy, involving the handling of the dye and the cloth, the working of the material in the dye vats, the staining of the hands and the person with the colour. The dyer was marked by his trade, his hands and skin stained with the colours he worked with, and the work was laborious and dirty as well as malodorous. To work as a dyer was to be coloured by one's trade, stained and smelling of the materials one worked with, a visible and odorous mark of the disagreeable craft. The dyer bore the signs of his work upon his very body, coloured and scented by the trade he plied. The woad dyer thus, like the tanner and the fuller, performed an essential service in the great cloth industry, producing the colours that made the finished fabrics beautiful and desirable, but did so through a trade that was malodorous, messy, and physically demanding. His work was skilled and valuable, supplying the important blue dye that coloured so much Tudor cloth, and yet it was disagreeable in the extreme, marked by one of the worst smells of any trade. The dyer, coloured and scented by his craft, endured the unpleasant realities of his work in the service of the beauty of the finished cloth, another of the essential but grim trades of the age. Let that colourful picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a job that took its workers out into the water in search of a curious and slippery creature, the leech collector. We turn now to a job that combined discomfort, mild danger, and a distinctly unpleasant method in the service of the medicine of the age, the leech collector, whose task was to gather the leeches that Tudor physicians used in their treatments. For the medicine of the age made much use of leeches, and someone had to catch them, and the way they were caught was disagreeable enough to earn the trade its place in our catalogue of grim work. The demand for leeches arose from their use in medicine, for the physicians of the age employed them in various treatments, and this created a real need for a steady supply of the creatures. Leeches were valued in the medicine of the time, used in the treatment of various conditions, and so they had to be gathered in numbers to supply the physicians and apothecaries who used them. This gave rise to the trade of the leech collector, whose task was to find and catch the leeches in the ponds and marshes where they lived, gathering them for sale to those who needed them. The trade existed to supply the medical demand, a humble link in the chain of Tudor medicine. The method of collecting leeches was where the unpleasantness lay, for the traditional way to gather them was to wade into the waters where they lived and allow them to attach themselves to one's own legs, then collect them. The collector waded into the leech-infested ponds and marshes, and the leeches, drawn to the warmth, would attach themselves to the collector's legs, whereupon they could be gathered. This method, using the collector's own body to attract the creatures, was as disagreeable as it sounds, and it was the standard way of gathering the leeches, a thoroughly unpleasant means of harvesting them. The collector's own legs were the bait, and the gathering of the leeches a distinctly uncomfortable process. The work was not only unpleasant, but carried its discomforts and minor dangers, for wading in cold and marshy waters for long periods was cold and tiring work, and the loss of blood to the leeches, repeated day after day, could weaken the collector over time. The trade took its toll on those who plied it, the cold and wet and the repeated attentions of the leeches wearing on the body, a hard and uncomfortable way to make a living. The leech collector endured these discomforts as a matter of course, wading the cold waters and bearing the creature's attentions in order to gather the valued leeches. It was a job that used up the body of the one who did it, in the service of the medicine of the age. The leech collector thus performed a humble but necessary service for the medicine of the time, supplying the leeches that the physicians valued, but did so through a method that was uncomfortable, mildly hazardous, and thoroughly disagreeable. The trade reminds us of the strange demands that the medicine of the age could make, and of the humble workers who met those demands through unpleasant means, wading the marshes to gather the creatures on which a part of Tudor medicine depended. The leech collector, cold and wet and attended by leeches, earned a modest living through one of the more curious and disagreeable of the age's trades. Let that picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a job of great solemnity and sadness, undertaken in the shadow of the plague, the work of the searcher of the dead. We come now to a job that carried a weight of solemnity and sadness quite unlike the others we have considered, a role that existed in the shadow of one of the great terrors of the age, the plague, and that we shall treat with particular gentleness and respect. This was the searcher of the dead, whose task was to examine those who had died and to determine the cause of death, a role of real importance in a time of plague, and one that carried both hardship and a certain grim dignity. The role arose from the need, particularly in times of plague, to know how people had died, to identify the victims of the disease, so that the spread of the plague could be tracked and, as far as possible, managed. When someone died, it was important to know whether the death was from plague or from some other cause, for this information mattered greatly to the authorities trying to cope with the disease, and so someone had to examine the dead and make this determination. This was the task of the searchers, who examined the bodies of the deceased and reported on the cause of death, providing information vital to the management of the plague. Their work, grim as it was, served a genuinely important purpose in a time of terror. The searchers were very often older women, poor women who took on this difficult work, and they occupied a strange and somewhat isolated position in society because of the grim nature of their duties. The role was frequently given to such women, who undertook the examination of the dead as a means of earning a living, however hard and unpleasant the work. Because their duties brought them into contact with the plague dead, the searchers were often kept at a distance by others, marked out and somewhat shunned because of the grim and dangerous nature of their work. They occupied a lonely position, these women who dealt with the dead, isolated by the very service they performed for their community. The work carried real hardship and real danger, for it was emotionally difficult, dealing constantly with death and sorrow, and it was physically dangerous, bringing the searchers into contact with the plague that they were tasked with identifying. The searchers faced the sadness of their constant contact with death, and the genuine peril of exposure to the disease, a doubly hard burden that made their work among the most difficult of the age. We shall not dwell on the sorrowful details, but the searchers bore a heavy weight, undertaking a grim and dangerous duty in the shadow of the plague, serving their community at real cost to themselves. Theirs was a hard and sorrowful calling, yet there was a real dignity in the work of the searchers, for they performed a genuinely necessary service in a time of great fear and need, undertaking a difficult and dangerous duty that few others would do, and doing it in the service of their community. However grim and however shunned, the searchers filled an essential role, providing the information that helped the authorities to cope with the plague, bearing the burden of contact with the dead so that others need not. There is something to honour in this, in the willingness of these poor women to undertake so hard and sorrowful a duty, and we remember them tonight with respect and gentleness, these searchers of the dead, who served their community in its darkest hours. Let that solemn reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a job that dealt with the living pests that plagued the Tudor world, the rat catcher. We turn now to a job that was engaged in a constant battle against one of the persistent nuisances of the Tudor world, the vermin that infested homes and streets and stores, spreading dirt and destroying food and carrying disease. The rat catcher, whose task was to control the rats and other pests that plagued the age. For the Tudor world was much troubled by vermin, and the rat catcher waged a perpetual war against them, a job that was dirty, sometimes dangerous, and never done. The problem the rat catcher addressed was a serious one, for rats and other vermin were a genuine plague upon the Tudor world, infesting buildings, destroying stored food, spreading filth, and carrying disease. The rats were everywhere, in the homes and the stores and the streets, a constant nuisance and a real threat to health and property, and their control was a genuine need. The rat catcher existed to meet this need, to reduce the numbers of the vermin, and to protect homes and stores from their depredations, a service that was genuinely valuable in a world so troubled by pests. The battle against the vermin was constant, and the rat catcher was its foot soldier. The work involved catching and killing the rats by various means, the setting of traps, the use of animals trained to catch them, and other methods of dealing with the pests. The rat catcher developed skills and methods for finding and catching the vermin, plying his trade with the tools and techniques of his craft, a specialized knowledge of the habits of the rats and the means of catching them. Some rat catchers became known for their skill, developing reputations, and even a certain colourful fame, for the catching of the vermin was a real skill, and those who did it well were valued. The rat catcher was a specialist in his humble way, master of the arts of pest control. The work was, however, dirty and sometimes dangerous, for it brought the rat catcher into contact with the filthy and disease-carrying vermin, and the bites and the exposure to the pests carried real risks to health. Handling the rats, being bitten by them, exposed to the filth and disease they carried, the rat catcher faced genuine hazards in his work, risks to his health from the very creatures he was tasked with catching. The trade was dirty and disagreeable, bringing its practitioner into constant contact with the filthy vermin, and it carried real dangers, the bites and the diseases that the rats could transmit. It was a hard and hazardous way to make a living, this constant battle with the pests. The rat catcher thus performed a genuinely useful service, waging his perpetual war against the vermin that plagued the age, protecting homes and stores and health from the depredations of the pests, but did so through dirty and dangerous work that brought him into constant contact with the filthy creatures. His was a humble but valuable trade, never finished, for the vermin could never be wholly defeated, only kept in check, and the rat catcher laboured on against an enemy that could not be beaten, dirty and hazardous work in the service of a real need. There is a certain colourful heroism in the rat catcher's endless battle, a humble war waged against the pests of the age. Let that picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a trade that battled not the living pests but the filth of the streets themselves, the raker. If the gong farmer dealt with the filth of the household and the rat catcher with the living pests, then there was another worker whose lot was to contend with the filth of the streets themselves, the mud and the muck and the refuse that gathered in the public ways of the Tudor town. This was the raker, sometimes called the scavenger, whose humble and disagreeable task was to clear the streets of the filth that accumulated there, and whose trade was among the more thankless and unpleasant of the age. Let us consider, then, the work of the raker, and what it was to spend one's days clearing the muck of the Tudor streets. To understand the raker's work, we must first understand the state of the Tudor streets, which were, by our standards, filthy in the extreme, for there was no organised system of sanitation such as we enjoy, and the streets gathered all manner of refuse and filth, the mud of the unpaved ways, churned by feet and hooves and wheels, mixed with the refuse thrown from houses, the droppings of the many animals that passed through the streets, the waste of the markets, and all the other filth of a crowded town, to form a foul and pervasive muck that lay upon the public ways. This was the material that the raker had to contend with, the accumulated filth of the town, gathering in the streets and requiring to be cleared away lest it become altogether intolerable. The Tudor street was a dirty place, and the raker's task was to keep it from becoming dirtier still. The raker's work then was to gather up this filth, to rake and shovel the mud and the muck and the refuse from the streets, to load it into his cart, and to carry it away to be dumped beyond the town or, sometimes, sold as manure for the fields. It was heavy, dirty, malodorous labour, the raking and shovelling of the foul street muck, conducted amid the stench and the filth, hour after hour, in all weathers. The raker laboured in the dirtiest of materials, his hands and clothes and person marked by the filth he handled, breathing the foul airs of the muck he cleared, a worker steeped in the disagreeable substance of his trade. His was a labour that few would envy, conducted in the filth of the streets, gathering the muck that others were only too glad to be rid of. The work was not only unpleasant, but often thankless and poorly regarded, for the raker occupied a lowly place, marked by the filth of his trade, and looked down upon accordingly, a humble figure at the margins of the town's working life. Like others who dealt with filth, the raker was regarded with a certain disdain, his lowly status a reflection of the disagreeable materials he handled, and his labour, though genuinely necessary, was little honoured. He toiled in the muck for a modest living, doing work that had to be done but that brought him little respect. A humble worker, cleaning up after the town in one of its more thankless trades. The raker's reward was small, and his standing lower still, for all the real necessity of his work. And necessary his work truly was, for, without the rakers to clear the streets, the filth would have accumulated intolerably, the public ways would have become impassable and pestilential, and the health and comfort of the town would have suffered still more than they did. The raker performed a genuine public service, keeping the streets at least somewhat clear of the worst of the filth, doing the humble but essential work of urban cleanliness in an age that had little other means of it. His labour, disagreeable and lowly as it was, helped to keep the Tudor town livable, a real contribution to the common good made through the dirtiest of means. The raker, clearing the muck of the streets, served his town in a way that was easy to overlook but genuinely valuable. The raker thus performed an essential but thoroughly disagreeable service, clearing the filth of the Tudor streets, so that the town might remain livable, but did so through heavy, dirty, and thankless labour amid the muck and the stench. His work was genuinely necessary, a humble form of the sanitation on which the health of the town depended, and yet it was among the lowliest and most unpleasant of trades, conducted in the filth of the public ways for little reward or respect. The raker, shoveling the muck of the streets into his cart, kept the Tudor town from drowning in its own filth, another of the essential but grim workers whose humble labour served the common good. Let that picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a trade that dealt with the rendering of fat into useful things, the tallow chandler. We turn now to a trade that produced two of the most essential everyday items of the Tudor world, light and cleanliness, but did so through a process that was hot, smelly, and disagreeable. The tallow chandler, who made the candles and, in related trades, the soap on which everyday life depended, from animal fat. For the making of these essential items required the rendering and working of tallow, a greasy and malodorous business that earns the trade its place in our catalogue. The chandler's products were genuinely essential, for candles were the principal source of artificial light in the Tudor world, and the humble tallow candle, made from animal fat, was what lit the homes of ordinary people through the dark hours. Without candles, the nights would have been dark indeed, and so the making of them was a genuinely important trade, supplying the light on which so much of life depended. The tallow chandler produced these humble but essential candles, and related workers produced soap, another important product made from similar materials, so that the trade supplied both light and the means of cleanliness. These were valuable products essential to everyday life. The unpleasantness of the trade lay in the rendering of the tallow, the melting down of animal fat that was the basis of both candles and soap, a process that was hot, greasy, and produced a powerful and disagreeable smell. The working of the fat, the melting and rendering and shaping of it, filled the chandler's workplace with a greasy heat and a foul odour, an unpleasant atmosphere in which the chandler laboured. We shall not dwell on the details, but the rendering of tallow was a notoriously smelly business, and the chandler worked amid the grease and the stench of the melting fat, a hot and malodorous labour. The making of the light and the soap depended on this disagreeable process. The work was also hot and physically demanding, for the rendering of the fat required heat, and the chandler laboured over hot vats of melting tallow, dipping or moulding the candles, working the hot and greasy material with physical effort. The combination of heat and grease and smell made the chandler's workplace a thoroughly disagreeable environment, and the work itself was laborious, the making of the candles and soap requiring real effort and skill. The chandler sweated over his hot tallow, working the greasy material in the heat and the stench, a hard and unpleasant labour in the service of his essential products. It was hot, smelly, greasy work, disagreeable in every particular. The tallow chandler thus produced two of the most essential items of everyday life, the light of the candle and the cleanliness of the soap, but did so through a trade that was hot, greasy and malodorous, earning his place among the disagreeable occupations of the age. His products were genuinely valuable, lighting the homes and enabling the cleanliness of the Tudor world, and yet the making of them was thoroughly unpleasant, a hot and smelly labour amid the rendering fat. The chandler, sweating over his tallow, supplied the light and the soap on which everyday life depended, another of the essential but disagreeable trades that kept the Tudor world running. Let that picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a trade that involved great heat in the making of another everyday essential, the salt boiler. We turn now to a trade that laboured amid intense and constant heat to produce one of the most essential of all commodities, a substance so important that it was central to the preservation of food and the very survival of the population, the salt boiler, who produced salt by the boiling of brine, a hot, hard and exhausting labour. For salt was vital to the Tudor world, and its making was a genuinely grueling job that earns its place in our catalogue. The importance of salt can hardly be overstated, for in an age without refrigeration, salt was the principal means of preserving food, of keeping meat and fish through the months when fresh food was scarce, and this made it an essential commodity on which survival depended. Salt preserved the food that carried people through the winter and the lean times, and without it, the preservation of food would have been impossible. This made the production of salt a genuinely vital industry, and the salt boiler, who produced it, a worker in an essential trade. The humble salt was a substance of the greatest importance, and its making a matter of real necessity. The making of salt by boiling involved the heating of brine, salt water, over fires until the water evaporated and the salt was left behind, a process that required intense and sustained heat and constant attention. The salt boiler tended the fires and the vats of boiling brine, working amid great heat as the water was boiled away and the salt gathered, a hot and demanding labour. The process required the maintenance of the fires and the tending of the boiling brine over long periods, the worker labouring constantly in the heat of the operation. It was work conducted amid fire and steam and heat, a hot and exhausting business. The conditions of the work were genuinely grueling, for the salt boiler laboured amid intense heat, in an atmosphere of steam and fire, performing hard physical work over long hours in the most trying of conditions. The heat was constant and oppressive, the work physically demanding, the hours long, and the salt boiler endured all this to produce the essential salt. The combination of the heat and the physical labour and the long hours made salt boiling one of the more grueling of trades, a job that taxed the body severely and offered little relief from the oppressive conditions. The salt boiler sweated constantly at his hot and heavy work, enduring the trying conditions of his essential trade. The salt boiler thus produced one of the most essential commodities of the age, the salt that preserved food and sustained the population, but did so through a trade that was hot, hard, and exhausting, labouring amid fire and steam in the most grueling of conditions. His product was genuinely vital, essential to the preservation of food and the survival of the people, and yet the making of it was a punishing labour, conducted in oppressive heat over long and demanding hours. The salt boiler, sweating at his boiling brine, supplied the vital salt on which so much depended, another of the essential but grueling trades of the Tudor world. Let that hot picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a solitary trade conducted amid smoke in the depths of the woods, the charcoal burner. We turn now to a trade conducted far from the towns, deep in the woods, in a solitary and smoky labour that kept its worker apart from the world for days and nights on end. The charcoal burner, or collier, who made the charcoal on which so many other trades depended, through a slow and demanding process that required constant attention. For charcoal was an essential fuel, and its making was a hard, lonely and smoky business that earns its place in our catalogue of grim work. The charcoal burner's product was genuinely important, for charcoal burned hotter and cleaner than raw wood, and was essential to many trades, above all the working of metals, which required the intense heat that charcoal could provide. The smiths and the metal workers and many other craftsmen depended on charcoal for their fires, and so its making was a necessary and valuable trade, supplying the fuel that many other crafts required. The charcoal burner, working in the woods, produced this essential fuel, a humble but important link in the chain of the age's industry. Without charcoal, much of the metalworking of the age could not have been done. The making of charcoal was a slow and demanding process, for it involved the careful, slow burning of wood in a covered mound, smouldering rather than blazing, over a period of days, and this required constant and unremitting attention. The wood was stacked and covered with earth and set to smoulder slowly, and the burn had to be watched and tended constantly, day and night, for many days, to ensure that it burned correctly and did not break into open flame. This meant that the charcoal burner could not leave his mound but had to tend it ceaselessly through the long days and nights of the burn, a constant vigil over the smouldering wood. The process demanded an unbroken attention that kept the worker tied to his labour without rest. Because the burn had to be tended constantly, the charcoal burner lived a solitary life in the woods, dwelling in a rough hut beside his mound, apart from the world for the duration of the burn, alone with his smouldering wood. He lived where he worked, in the depths of the woods, in a temporary shelter beside the burning mound, keeping his lonely vigil far from the company of others. This solitude was one of the defining features of the trade. The charcoal burner set apart in the woods, living a lonely life amid the smoke, isolated by the demands of his constant labour. His was a solitary existence, alone with the smouldering mound in the quiet of the woods. The work was smoky and dirty as well as lonely, for the charcoal burner lived amid the smoke of his mound, blackened by the soot and the charcoal, breathing the smoke and living in the grime of his trade. He was marked by his work, blackened with soot and charcoal, living in the smoke of the smouldering wood, a dirty and unhealthy environment. The combination of the loneliness, the constant vigilance, the smoke and the soot, made the charcoal burner's trade a hard and disagreeable one, a solitary labour amid the smoke of the woods. The charcoal burner, blackened and alone, tended his smouldering mound through the long days and nights, producing the essential charcoal through a hard, lonely and smoky labour. Let that smoky picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a trade conducted in the dark and dangerous depths of the earth, the miner. We turn now to one of the most dangerous of all the trades of the Tudor world, a job conducted in the dark and perilous depths beneath the earth, in conditions of real hazard and hardship. The miner, who dug the coal and the metals and the minerals on which the age increasingly depended. For mining was hard and dangerous work, conducted in the most difficult of conditions, and it earns its place among the very worst and most perilous of jobs. The importance of mining was growing through the Tudor age, for coal was increasingly used for fuel, and the mining of coal and of metals and other minerals was becoming a significant industry. The demand for coal and for metals drove the expansion of mining, and the miners who dug these materials from the earth performed an increasingly important service, supplying the fuel and the metals on which the economy depended. The work was genuinely valuable, producing the materials that the growing economy required, and the miner filled an essential and expanding role. The digging of the earth's resources was becoming ever more important to the life of the age. The conditions of mining were, however, extraordinarily hard and dangerous, for the miner laboured deep beneath the earth, in the dark and the damp, in cramped and difficult spaces, facing the constant perils of the underground world. The dangers were many and serious: the risk of collapse, the presence of dangerous gases, the hazards of flooding, the difficulties of working in the cramped and dark conditions far below the surface. The miner faced these perils as a matter of course, labouring in an environment of real and constant danger, where accidents could be sudden and deadly. Mining was among the most hazardous of all trades, its dangers grave and ever-present. The physical hardship of the work was equally severe, for the miner laboured with hand tools in the cramped and difficult spaces, digging and hauling in the dark and the damp, performing punishing physical labour in the most trying of conditions. The work was backbreaking, conducted in awkward and confined spaces, in the cold and wet and dark, with poor air and little light, a physical ordeal that taxed the body to its limits. The miner endured these conditions hour after hour, digging the coal and the metals in the perilous depths, a labour of extreme physical hardship. It was among the hardest as well as the most dangerous of all the trades of the age. There was, too, a particular darkness to the miner's world that set it apart from almost every other trade, for he laboured out of the sight of the sun, in a blackness relieved only by the feeble light of a candle or lamp, in cramped and airless spaces deep beneath the earth. To spend one's working life in such darkness, crawling and digging in the confined and lightless depths, was a hardship of its own kind, a removal from the light and air of the ordinary world into a cramped underworld of stone and shadow. The miner knew the earth from the inside, its weight above him, its darkness around him, its dangers pressing close, and he endured a working life spent in conditions that most people would scarcely have been able to bear at all. It was labour in a world apart, a dark and buried world entered each day and escaped only at day's end. The miner thus performed an increasingly essential service, digging the coal and the metals on which the growing economy depended, but did so through a trade of extreme danger and hardship, labouring in the perilous depths of the earth in the most difficult of conditions. His work was genuinely valuable, supplying the vital fuel and metals, and yet it was among the most hazardous and gruelling of all occupations, conducted amid constant peril and severe physical hardship. The miner, deep in the dark and dangerous earth, endured one of the very worst of jobs in the service of an essential and growing industry. Let that sober picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a trade conducted not in the depths of the earth, but on the surface of the sea, the sailor. We turn now to a trade conducted upon the sea, in an age when England was becoming a great seafaring nation, a job of hardship, danger, and endurance that took men far from home into the perils of the ocean. The sailor, whose hard life aboard the ships of the age earns its place in our catalogue of grim work. For the life of the Tudor sailor was extraordinarily hard, filled with danger and discomfort and privation, and few jobs demanded more of those who did them. The importance of seafaring was growing through the Tudor age, as England expanded its trade and its exploration and its naval power, and the sailors who manned the ships were essential to this expansion. The ships carried the trade and projected the power and undertook the voyages of exploration that were making England a great maritime nation, and the sailors were the men who made this possible, working the ships through all the perils of the sea. Their work was genuinely important, essential to the growing maritime enterprise of the age, and the sailor filled a vital role in the expansion of English trade and power. The sea was becoming ever more important to England, and the sailors were its indispensable workers. The conditions of life at sea were, however, extraordinarily hard, for the sailor endured cramped and uncomfortable quarters, poor and monotonous food, hard physical labour, and the constant dangers of the sea. Life aboard ship was crowded and uncomfortable. The food was poor and often inadequate. The work was hard and demanding, and the conditions were trying in the extreme. The sailor endured all this for long periods, far from home and comfort, in the difficult and confined world of the ship. The hardships of the sailor's life were many and severe, a constant privation and discomfort that made the life aboard ship a genuine ordeal. The dangers of the sea were ever present and grave, for the sailor faced the perils of storm and shipwreck, of accident aboard ship, of the diseases that flourished in the cramped and unhealthy conditions, and of the other hazards of the maritime life. The sea was a dangerous place, and the sailor faced its perils constantly, the risk of drowning, of the ship being lost, of accident and injury and disease, a life lived amid genuine and serious danger. Many sailors did not return from their voyages, lost to the sea or to the diseases that afflicted the crews, and the trade was among the most dangerous of the age. The sailor risked his life in the service of the sea, facing perils that took many who followed the trade. There was, besides the danger and the hardship, a peculiar loneliness to the sailor's life, for once the ship had left the land behind, he was cut off entirely from home and family, sealed for weeks or months within the small wooden world of the vessel, with no news and no escape, and no comfort but the company of his fellow crew. To be so long away, so far from all that was familiar, adrift upon the vast and indifferent sea, was a hardship of the spirit as well as the body, a long separation from the ordinary world that few other trades imposed. The sailor endured not only the physical trials of the sea, but this long exile upon it, the weeks and months cut off from home, and it was no small part of what made his life among the hardest of the age. The sea gave him his living, but it took him far from everything else. The sailor thus performed an essential service in the growing maritime enterprise of the age, working the ships that carried England's trade and power across the seas, but did so through a life of extreme hardship and danger, enduring the privations and perils of the maritime world. His work was genuinely important, essential to the expansion of English trade and exploration, and yet it was among the hardest and most dangerous of all ways of life, a constant ordeal of discomfort and peril. The sailor, far from home upon the dangerous sea, endured one of the hardest of lives in the service of England's maritime greatness. Let that picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now from the wide sea to the hot kitchen, and to the humble labour of the turnspit. We turn now from the great and dangerous trades to a humbler job, one conducted in the hot kitchens of the great houses, a job of tedium and discomfort that fell to the lowliest of the kitchen workers, the turnspit, whose task was to turn the roasting meat before the fire, hour after hour, in the heat and the monotony of the kitchen. For the roasting of meat required constant turning, and this wearisome task earns its place among the more miserable of jobs. The task arose from the way meat was cooked in the great kitchens, for large joints of meat were roasted before the open fire, and they had to be turned constantly so that they cooked evenly, this turning being essential to the proper roasting of the meat. Someone had to turn the spit on which the meat was fixed, keeping it moving before the fire so that all sides were cooked, a task that had to be maintained throughout the long roasting. This was the turnspit's job, the constant turning of the roasting meat, a humble but necessary task in the preparation of the great meals of the wealthy households. The roasting of the meat depended on this wearisome labour. The conditions of the work were genuinely miserable, for the turnspit laboured close to the roaring fire, in intense heat, turning the spit for hour after hour in a tedious and exhausting monotony. The heat of the fire was oppressive, the work endlessly repetitive, and the turnspit endured both, standing by the hot fire and turning the spit through the long hours of roasting. The combination of the intense heat and the mindless repetition made the work thoroughly miserable, a wearisome ordeal by the roasting fire. The turnspit sweated by the flames, turning and turning the meat, in one of the more tediously uncomfortable of the kitchen jobs. So wearisome was the task that various means were devised to relieve the human turnspit, including, remarkably, the use of dogs specially trained to turn the spit by running in a wheel connected to it. These turnspit dogs, bred and trained for the purpose, ran in a wheel that turned the spit, taking over the wearisome task from the human worker, a curious solution to the misery of the job. The existence of these specially bred dogs, employed to spare humans the tedious labour, is itself a testament to how miserable the task was, so unpleasant that dogs were trained to do it instead. The turnspit's job was so wearisome that it was, in some kitchens, given over to animals. The turnspit thus performed a humble but necessary task in the great kitchens of the age, turning the roasting meat that fed the wealthy households, but did so in conditions of real misery, labouring in the intense heat of the fire, through the tedious monotony of the endless turning. His was a lowly and wearisome job, uncomfortable and mind-numbingly repetitive, one of the more miserable of the humble kitchen trades. The turnspit, sweating by the roasting fire, turning the meat hour after hour, endured a small but real misery in the service of the great meals of the age. A humble worker in the hot and laborious world of the Tudor kitchen. Let that picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the lowliest of all the kitchen workers, the scullion. We remain in the hot and busy kitchen to consider the lowliest of all its workers, the one who did the dirtiest and most menial of the kitchen tasks, at the very bottom of the household hierarchy, the scullion, the kitchen drudge whose life of endless scrubbing and hauling and menial labour earns a place in our catalogue of hard and humble jobs. For the great kitchens required much lowly labour, and it was the scullion who provided it, in a life of unremitting drudgery. The scullion occupied the very bottom of the kitchen hierarchy, the lowliest of all the workers in the great household kitchens, charged with the most menial and unpleasant of the many tasks that the kitchen required. Above the scullion were the cooks and the other kitchen workers, each with their station, and at the very bottom was the scullion, who did the work that no one else would do, the dirtiest and most laborious of the kitchen tasks. This lowly position meant a life of menial drudgery, the endless performance of the hardest and humblest work of the kitchen. The scullion was the drudge of the kitchen, at the bottom of all. The tasks that fell to the scullion were many and menial. Above all, the endless washing and scrubbing of the pots and dishes and kitchen equipment, the hauling of water and fuel, the cleaning of the kitchen, and the other lowly labours. The great kitchens generated mountains of washing up, vast quantities of greasy pots and dishes that had to be scrubbed clean, and this fell to the scullion, along with the hauling of the heavy loads of water and fuel that the kitchen required, and the cleaning of the kitchen itself. It was endless, dirty, physical work, the humble labour that kept the kitchen functioning, performed by the lowly scullion hour after hour. The drudgery was constant and unremitting. The conditions of the scullion's life were hard, for the work was physically demanding, performed in the heat and bustle of the kitchen, over long hours, with little rest and less regard. The scullion laboured in the hot and crowded kitchen, at the beck and call of those above, performing the hardest and dirtiest work through the long day, a life of physical toil and low status. The combination of hard physical labour, poor conditions, long hours, and lowly status made the scullion's life a hard one, a drudgery with little reward or respect. The scullion endured this menial existence at the bottom of the kitchen, labouring constantly at the humblest of tasks. The scullion thus performed the essential but lowly labour that kept the great kitchens functioning, the endless washing and hauling and cleaning, without which the kitchen could not have operated, but did so in a life of unremitting drudgery at the very bottom of the household. The work was genuinely necessary, for the pots had to be washed and the water hauled and the kitchen cleaned, and yet it was the humblest and hardest of labours, performed by the lowliest of workers for little reward. The scullion, scrubbing endlessly in the hot kitchen, endured a life of menial toil in the service of the great household, a humble worker at the very bottom of the Tudor world of work. Let that picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to another trade of hard physical labour, often done by women, the laundress. We turn now to one of the hardest of the everyday trades, a labour of great physical effort, usually performed by women, dealing with the endless and heavy task of washing the clothes and linens of the age. The laundress, whose hard and physically demanding work earns her place among the grueling jobs of the Tudor world. For the washing of clothes, in an age without any of the machines we now use, was a genuinely arduous labour, and the laundress bore its full weight. The task of laundry was, in the Tudor age, an enormous physical undertaking, for there were none of the machines that now do our washing, and every stage had to be done by hand, with great physical effort. The clothes and linens had to be soaked and scrubbed and pounded and rinsed and wrung and dried, all by hand, a laborious process that demanded real strength and endurance. The washing of a household's linen was a major labor, occupying long hours of hard physical work, and it fell to the laundress to perform it, bearing the full weight of this arduous task. Laundry was among the most physically demanding of the everyday labors. The work involved handling heavy wet fabrics and using harsh substances, for the wet linen was heavy and difficult to work, and the cleaning relied on substances that were hard on the hands, including the lye and other agents used to clean the clothes. The laundress hauled and scrubbed and wrung the heavy wet fabrics, her hands in the water and the harsh cleaning agents through the long hours of the work, a labor that was hard on the body and especially on the hands. The combination of the heavy wet fabrics and the harsh substances made the work physically punishing, wearing on the body of the laundress who performed it. Her hands and arms bore the marks of the arduous labor. The conditions of the work were hard, for the laundress labored over tubs of water in all weathers, her hands constantly wet, performing heavy physical work over long hours in difficult conditions. The washing might be done outdoors or in cold and damp conditions, the laundress's hands perpetually in the water, the work heavy and continuous. The physical toll of the work was real, the constant wetness and the heavy labor and the harsh substances wearing on the body over time. The laundress endured these hard conditions as a matter of course, laboring at her tubs to produce the clean linen that the household required, a hard and physically demanding trade. There was, too, a relentlessness to the laundress's work that wore upon her as much as its physical weight, for the washing was never truly finished, the linen always accumulating again, the great labor of the wash to be repeated again and again without end. However hard she labored, however much she washed and wrung and dried, there was always more to be done, the endless cycle of soiling and washing turning without pause, so that her toil had no natural conclusion, but only the brief respite before it began once more. This unending quality, the labor that could never be completed, added a weariness of its own to the hard physical toil, the sense of a task that stretched on without end. The laundress labored not merely hard, but endlessly, at a work that renewed itself as fast as she could do it. The laundress thus performed an essential everyday service, the washing of the clothes and linens without which cleanliness would have been impossible, but did so through a trade of hard physical labor, handling heavy wet fabrics and harsh substances over long hours in difficult conditions. Her work was genuinely necessary, for the linen had to be washed, and yet it was among the most physically arduous of the everyday trades, a punishing labor that wore on the body. The laundress, laboring at her tubs, produced the clean linen of the Tudor world through hard and grueling work, another of the essential but demanding trades so often borne by the women of the age. Let that picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a job of grave and solemn responsibility, one that set its holder apart from all others, the executioner. We come now to a job of grave and solemn character, one that carried a heavy weight of responsibility, and that set its holder apart from the rest of society in a profound way, and we shall treat it with particular care and restraint, dwelling not at all on its grim particulars, but only on its social character and the strange isolation it brought. This was the executioner, who carried out the ultimate sentences of the law, and whose position, though necessary to the justice of the age, made him a figure apart. We shall speak of the role only in the gentlest and most general terms. The role of the executioner existed because the justice of the age prescribed the ultimate penalties for serious crimes, and someone had to carry out the sentences that the courts imposed. This was a function of the legal system of the age, a part of how justice was administered, and the executioner was the official who performed this grave duty. We shall not speak of the details of the work, which need not trouble our quiet journey, But only note that the role existed as part of the justice system of the time, a necessary office in the administration of the law, as that age understood it. The executioner filled this solemn role, carrying out the gravest sentences of the courts. What concerns us here is not the grim work itself, but the strange social position it created. For the executioner, because of the nature of his duty, was set apart from the rest of society, regarded with a mixture of awe and unease, and often kept at a distance by his fellows. The nature of his office marked him out, isolated him from ordinary social life, so that he occupied a lonely and unusual position, necessary to society yet held apart from it. This social isolation was one of the defining features of the executioner's lot, a figure essential to the justice of the age, yet shunned and set apart because of the grave nature of his duty. He lived in a strange solitude, marked by his office. The role carried, too, a heavy weight of responsibility, and, one imagines, a real burden upon those who held it, for the gravity of the duty was immense, and the performing of it must have weighed heavily upon the person. We shall not dwell on this, but it is worth acknowledging that the executioner bore a genuine burden, a weight of responsibility and, surely, of personal difficulty in performing the grave duty that his office required. The role was not an easy one to bear, whatever its holder's feelings, and the weight of it set the executioner apart in his own experience as well as in the eyes of society. His was a heavy and solitary burden. The executioner thus occupied a grave and solitary place in the Tudor world, filling a role that the justice of the age deemed necessary, but that set its holder profoundly apart, regarded with unease and kept at a distance, bearing a heavy burden in isolation. We remember the role tonight not for its grim particulars, which we have left entirely aside, but for the strange and lonely position it created, a figure necessary to the age yet held apart from it, dwelling in an isolation created by his solemn office. It stands as a reminder of the harder edges of the age's justice, and of the lonely lot of the one who was set apart to serve it. Let that solemn reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a curious and rather gentler role. Born of the strange, we turn now to one of the most curious jobs in the whole story of the Tudor court, a role that arose from the strange logic of royal privilege, and that seems to us both unfair and rather absurd. The whipping boy, a boy who was said to receive the punishments that a young prince had earned, being punished in the prince's stead. We shall consider this curious arrangement with a light touch, for it is one of the odder footnotes in the history of royal childhood. The arrangement arose from the special status of royal and princely children, for a prince, being of royal blood and destined perhaps to be king, could not be physically punished by an ordinary tutor or servant, as the striking of a royal person was not permitted. Yet children, even princely ones, required correction in their education, and this created a problem: how to discipline a prince who could not himself be struck. The solution, according to the tradition, was the whipping boy, a boy who would receive the punishment in the prince's place, being punished when the prince did wrong. The prince's own inviolability created the need for a substitute to bear his punishments. The whipping boy was, according to the tradition, a boy of ordinary birth who was educated alongside the prince, sharing his lessons and his company, and who would be punished when the prince misbehaved or failed in his studies. When the prince did wrong, it was the whipping boy who was chastised, bearing the physical correction that the prince himself could not receive, a substitute sufferer for the prince's faults. This seems to us a most unfair arrangement, the innocent boy punished for the prince's misdeeds, and it strikes us as both unjust and rather absurd, a curious product of the strange logic of royal privilege. The whipping boy bore the consequences of another's faults, yet the arrangement was perhaps less purely unfair than it appears, for the whipping boy shared in the prince's education and company, enjoying advantages of association and schooling that an ordinary boy would not have had, and the bond between prince and whipping boy could be a real one. The whipping boy gained a fine education and a close association with royalty, real advantages that came with the role, and the shared experience could create a genuine friendship between the two boys. Moreover, the very fact that the prince cared for his whipping boy could serve as a check on the prince's behavior, for a prince who was fond of his companion might behave better to spare him punishment. The arrangement had its compensations and its subtle logic, curious as it seems. The whipping boy thus occupied one of the strangest positions in the Tudor world of work and service, a boy who bore the punishments of a prince, an arrangement that seems unfair and absurd, yet had its own curious logic and its real compensations. It reflects the strange world of royal privilege, in which the inviolability of the royal person could create such peculiar arrangements, and in which a boy might make a place for himself by the odd expedient of bearing another's punishments. The whipping boy, punished for the faults of a prince yet educated at his side, stands as one of the great curiosities in the story of Tudor service, a strange and rather poignant footnote to the history of royal childhood. Let that curious picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a role that was meant to bring not suffering but laughter, the fool. We turn now to a role that was meant to bring laughter and delight, one of the more famous of all the court positions, and one that we might not think of as a bad job at all, the fool, or jester, whose task was to amuse and entertain. Yet as we shall see, even this seemingly enviable role had its hardships and its precariousness, and the life of the fool was not always as merry as it might appear. Let us consider, then, this curious and famous occupation. The role of the fool was to provide amusement and entertainment, to make the court or the household laugh, through wit and jest and antic and song, a source of merriment and diversion in the great houses and the royal court. The fool was a valued source of entertainment, employed to lighten the mood and to amuse the company, a familiar and cherished figure in the households of the great. This seems, on the face of it, a pleasant enough role, the making of laughter and the providing of delight, and in some ways it was, for the successful fool enjoyed a place of favour and affection. To be the fool was to be the bringer of merriment. The fool enjoyed, moreover, a curious freedom, for he was often permitted to say things that others could not, to speak boldly, and even to mock and criticize under the cover of his foolery. This license, the freedom to speak truths and jests that would not be tolerated from others, was one of the peculiar privileges of the fool, who could get away with boldness and mockery because it came in the guise of foolery. The clever fool could use this freedom to real effect, speaking truths to power under the protection of his role, a curious liberty that made the position more than mere clowning. The fool's license was a real and valued privilege, yet the role had its hardships and its precariousness, for the fool depended entirely on the favour of his master, had constantly to amuse and please, and could fall from favour if he failed to entertain or gave offence. The pressure to be constantly amusing, to please and divert, was a real burden, and the fool's position was insecure, dependent on continued favour and vulnerable to a fall if he displeased. The license to speak boldly carried risks as well, for a jest that gave too much offence could bring disaster. The fool lived by his wits in a precarious position, his fortunes dependent on his continued ability to amuse and on the goodwill of his master. It was not so secure or easy a life as it might appear. The fool thus occupied a curious and double-edged position, a role of favour and freedom and merriment that was also precarious and demanding, dependent on the constant provision of amusement and the maintenance of favour. His was a life of wit and laughter, enjoying real privileges and a cherished place, and yet also a life of pressure and insecurity, always dependent on pleasing and always vulnerable to a fall. The fool, bringer of laughter and speaker of bold truths, lived a life more complex and more precarious than his merry role might suggest, one of the most curious of all the occupations of the age. Let that curious picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a job that involved the testing of one of the age's most important products, the ale conner. We turn now to a job that must have had its compensations, for it involved the tasting and testing of ale, that most beloved of Tudor drinks, in the service of ensuring its quality. The ale conner, an official whose task was to check that the ale sold in his town was of proper quality and correctly measured. It is a job that sounds rather agreeable, and in some ways it was, though it carried real responsibility, and it comes wrapped in a famous and probably fanciful legend. Let us consider this curious official role. The ale conner was an official appointed to oversee the quality and measure of the ale sold in a town. For ale was so important and so central to daily life that its quality and honest sale were matters of real public concern. The authorities wished to ensure that the ale sold was wholesome and of proper quality, and that it was sold in honest measure at fair prices, and so they appointed officials to check these things. The ale conner was such an official, charged with testing the ale and ensuring that it met the required standards, a role of real public importance in a world so dependent on its ale. The overseeing of the ale was a genuine civic duty. The work involved the tasting and testing of the ale to judge its quality, going about the ale houses and sampling the ale to ensure it was good and wholesome and properly made. This tasting of the ale was the heart of the ale conner's work, the judging of its quality by sampling it, a task that required a good palate and sound judgment. It sounds an agreeable enough duty, the sampling of ale, and no doubt it had its pleasures, though it carried the serious responsibility of ensuring the quality of an important product. The ale conner tasted and judged, a connoisseur of ale in the public service. There is a famous legend attached to the ale conner, probably fanciful but often repeated, that he tested the ale by pouring some on a bench and sitting in it in leather breeches to see whether it was sticky with sugar and thus improperly made. According to this tale, the ale conner would sit in the spilled ale for a time, and if his breeches stuck to the bench when he rose, the ale was judged to contain too much sugar and to be improperly brewed. This colourful story, whether true or not, has become attached to the ale conner, a memorable, if probably exaggerated account of how the testing was supposedly done. It adds a note of comedy to the role, this image of the official sitting in spilled ale to test its quality. The ale conner thus performed a genuine and important public service, overseeing the quality and measure of the ale on which so much of Tudor life depended, through a role that involved the not entirely disagreeable duty of tasting the ale, wrapped in its famous and colourful legend. His was a job with real responsibilities and, one imagines, real compensations, the serious duty of ensuring the quality of an important product, combined with the agreeable task of sampling it. The ale conner, tasting and judging the ale of his town, stands as one of the more agreeable and curious of the official roles of the age, a connoisseur in the public service, with a famous legend attached to his name. Let that agreeable picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a role of intimate service and real sacrifice, the wet nurse. We turn now to a role of intimate service, one performed by women, that involved a genuine personal sacrifice, and that reveals much about the arrangements of the age. The wet nurse, a woman who nursed and suckled the infant children of others, usually of wealthier families, in place of the child's own mother. It is a role that we might not think of as a job at all, and yet it was a real and important occupation, and one that carried real personal cost. Let us consider it with tenderness. The role of the wet nurse arose from the custom, common among the wealthier families of the age, of employing another woman to nurse and suckle their infant children, rather than the mother doing so herself. For various reasons, wealthier mothers often did not nurse their own children, and so a wet nurse was employed to perform this most intimate of services, to feed and nurture the infant in the mother's place. This created a real demand for wet nurses, women who would nurse the children of others, and it was a recognized and important occupation, particularly among poorer women who could earn a living in this way. The nursing of others' children was a real trade. The wet nurse was typically a poorer woman who had recently had a child of her own, and who was therefore able to nurse, and who took on the nursing of a wealthier family's child as a means of earning a living. She would care for and nurse the infant entrusted to her, often taking the child into her own home or going to live with the family, devoting herself to the nurture of the child in place of its mother. This was intimate and important work, the nurture of a young child in its most vulnerable time, and the wet nurse played a central role in the life of the child she nursed. The care of the infant was placed in her hands. The role carried a real personal cost, for the wet nurse who nursed another's child might have to neglect or give up the nursing of her own, a genuine sacrifice that reveals the hard choices that poverty imposed. To nurse a wealthy family's child for pay might mean that the wet nurse's own child was deprived, a hard and poignant consequence of the arrangement. The poorer woman's own family sacrificed to the service of the wealthier one. This personal cost was a real and sometimes tragic aspect of the wet nurse's role, the giving of her nurture to another's child at the expense of her own, a hard bargain forced by need. There was genuine sacrifice in the trade. The wet nurse thus performed a role of intimate and important service, nurturing the infant children of others in place of their mothers, an occupation that provided a living for poorer women, but that carried a real personal cost, sometimes at the expense of their own children. Her work was genuinely important, the nurture of vulnerable infants, and it reveals much about the arrangements and the hard choices of the age, the ways in which the needs of the wealthy were met by the service and sacrifice of the poor. The wet nurse, nursing another's child perhaps at the cost of her own, stands as a poignant figure in the story of Tudor work, a woman whose intimate service carried a genuine and sometimes heartbreaking sacrifice. Let that tender reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a hardy and colourful figure of the Tudor streets, the fishwife. We turn now to the hardy and colourful figures who sold their wares in the streets and markets of the Tudor towns, and in particular to the fishwife, whose hard trade and famous character earn her a place in our catalogue. The street sellers who cried their goods through the towns, enduring hard physical labour and rough conditions to make their living. For the selling of goods in the streets was a hard trade, and the fishwife in particular became a byword for a certain hardy and forthright character. Let us consider these figures of the Tudor street. The street sellers were essential to the everyday commerce of the Tudor town, for much buying and selling was done in the streets and markets, and the sellers who cried their wares, carrying their goods about the town, were a familiar and important part of daily life. Among them were the sellers of fish, the fishwives, who sold the fish that was an important part of the diet, carrying it through the streets and crying it for sale. These street sellers supplied the townspeople with food and goods, a vital part of the everyday economy, and the fishwife was among the most characteristic of them, a familiar figure crying her fish through the Tudor streets. The street trade was essential to the life of the town. The work of the fishwife was hard and physically demanding, for she had to obtain her fish, carry it, often over considerable distances and in heavy loads, and sell it through long hours in the streets, in all weathers and conditions. The carrying of the heavy loads of fish, the long hours of selling, the exposure to the weather, made the work physically arduous and uncomfortable, a hard way to make a living. The fishwife laboured under her heavy loads, crying her wares through the streets for long hours, a physically demanding and often uncomfortable trade. Her living was earned through hard bodily labour and long exposure to the streets. The fishwife became famous too for her character, for a certain forthright, loud and formidable manner that became proverbial, the fishwife's voice and tongue becoming a byword for a certain robust and outspoken style. The crying of wares required a powerful voice, and the rough world of the street trade bred a hardy and forthright manner, so that the fishwife became known for her loudness and her sharp tongue, a colourful and formidable figure. This proverbial character, the loud and forthright fishwife, became a stock figure of the age, a memorable if somewhat unflattering image of these hardy tradeswomen. The fishwife's robust manner was famous, born of her hard and public trade. The fishwife and her fellow street sellers thus performed an essential service in the everyday commerce of the Tudor town, supplying food and goods to the townspeople through the hard trade of street selling, enduring heavy labour and rough conditions to make their living. Their work was genuinely necessary, a vital part of the town's economy, and yet it was hard and physically demanding, conducted in the streets in all weathers, breeding the hardy and forthright character for which the fishwife became famous. The fishwife, crying her fish through the Tudor streets under her heavy load, stands as a colourful and hardy figure in the story of the age's work, a tradeswoman of real toughness and endurance. Let that colourful picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now from the individual trades to reflect on why the work of the age was so very hard. Before we turn to our closing reflections, let us consider one more figure, not a single trade but a whole class of young workers who entered the world of work through a hard and demanding road. The apprentice, the young person bound to a master to learn a trade, whose years of service could be a genuine ordeal of hard labour, strict discipline, and long subjection. For apprenticeship was the great path into the skilled trades, but it was a hard road, and the apprentice's lot deserves its place in our catalogue. Apprenticeship was the principal means by which young people entered the skilled trades of the age, being bound to a master craftsman for a term of years, during which they would learn the trade while serving the master. The young apprentice was placed with a master to learn the craft, living in the master's household and working for him through the years of the apprenticeship, in exchange for training in the trade. This was the recognised path into the skilled crafts, a system that trained the craftsmen of the age, and vast numbers of young people passed through it, bound to their masters for the long years of their apprenticeship. It was the gateway to a trade, but a hard one. The life of the apprentice could be genuinely hard, for the apprentice was subject to the master's authority and discipline, worked long hours at the tasks the master set, and occupied a lowly and subordinate position through the years of service. The apprentice laboured for the master, performing the work of the trade, and often the humbler tasks of the household as well, under a strict discipline and with little freedom. The years of apprenticeship were years of subordination and hard work, the young apprentice bound to serve and to obey, enduring the demands and the discipline of the master. It was a hard and subordinate life, however valuable the training it provided. The apprentice's subjection was considerable, for he was bound to the master for the full term, could not simply leave, and was subject to the master's authority in many aspects of life, not merely the work but conduct and behaviour as well. The apprentice's freedom was much constrained, his life ordered by the master's rule, his years of service a period of real subjection. The discipline could be harsh, and the apprentice had little recourse, bound as he was to serve out his term under the master's authority. This long subjection was the price of the training, the hard road through which the young worker gained his trade, years of subordinate service before he could become a craftsman in his own right. The path to a trade ran through years of hard service, yet the apprenticeship offered a real reward at its end, for the apprentice who completed his term gained a valuable trade, the skills and the standing of a craftsman, a means of livelihood and a place in the world of work. The hard years of service were an investment, purchasing the training and the qualification that would allow the former apprentice to make his living as a skilled craftsman. This real reward made the hard road worth travelling, the years of subjection leading to the valuable prize of a trade, and so young people endured the ordeal of apprenticeship for the sake of the livelihood it promised. The apprentice's hard road led, in the end, to the security of a skilled trade, a genuine reward for the years of hard service. Let that picture of the apprentice settle gently in the dark. We turn now to reflect on why all this work was so very hard. Having wandered through this long catalogue of grim and difficult jobs, we may pause to reflect on the deeper question that all of it raises. Why was the work of the Tudor age so very hard, so much harder than the work most of us know today? The answer lies in the fundamental conditions of that world, and understanding it helps us to see both the age and our own more clearly. The first and most important reason was the absence of machines, for the Tudor world had almost none of the mechanical power that now does so much of our heavy and unpleasant work, and this meant that nearly everything had to be done by human muscle. The lifting and hauling and digging, the pounding and grinding and carrying, the countless physical labours of the age, all had to be performed by human bodies, for there were no engines to do them. This absence of mechanical power made work overwhelmingly physical, demanding the constant exertion of human muscle, and it is the single greatest difference between the work of that age and our own. Without machines, everything fell upon the human body. The second reason was the absence of the knowledge and technology that now make work safer and easier. For the Tudor world lacked the understanding and the tools that now protect workers and ease their labours. There were no safety measures to protect against the dangers of the work, no knowledge of how to make hazardous trades safe, no technologies to ease the hardest tasks. This meant that work was not only hard but dangerous, and that the hardships and hazards of the trades were born without the protections we now take for granted. The lack of this knowledge and technology left the worker exposed to the full hardship and danger of the labour, unprotected and unaided. The third reason was the sheer necessity that drove people to do the work. For in a world without any safety net, people had to work to survive, and had to take whatever work was available, however hard or unpleasant. There was no support for those who could not work, no alternative to labour, and so people did what they had to do, took the grimmest of jobs, because the alternative was destitution. This necessity meant that even the very worst jobs found people to do them, driven by the need to survive, for there was no choice but to work. The hardness of the work was matched by the hardness of the necessity that compelled people to do it. Together, these conditions, the absence of machines, the lack of protective knowledge and technology, and the driving necessity of survival, made the work of the Tudor age extraordinarily hard, a world of physical toil and danger and unremitting labour utterly unlike our own. Understanding this helps us to see the age as it really was, a world in which work was hard in ways we can scarcely imagine, and in which ordinary people endured that hardness because they had no choice. It helps us too to appreciate the transformation that has since occurred, the coming of the machines, and the knowledge and the protections that have so eased the burden of work. The hardness of Tudor work was the hardness of a world without these things. Let that reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to honour the people who did all this hard work, the dignity of the workers. Having considered the hardness of the work and the reasons for it, let us pause now to honour the people who did it, the countless ordinary workers who performed the hard and grim and humble labours of the Tudor age. For there is a real dignity in their toil that deserves our recognition and respect. We have called these the worst of jobs, and so in many ways they were. But the people who did them were not to be pitied merely, but to be respected, and we should honour them before we close. The first thing to honour is the sheer necessity and value of the work they did, for however grim and humble, these jobs were genuinely necessary, performing the essential tasks that kept the Tudor world functioning. The gong farmer who cleaned the pits, the tanner who made the leather, the salt boiler who produced the salt, the miner who dug the coal, all did work that was genuinely needed, without which the world could not have run. Their labour, grim as it was essential, and there is dignity in the doing of necessary work, however humble, a real value in the service they performed for their communities. The worst of jobs were, very often, among the most necessary. The second thing to honour is the endurance and resilience of the workers, for they bore hard and unpleasant and dangerous labour, day after day, with a fortitude that is genuinely admirable. To do such work, to endure the hardship and the danger and the unpleasantness, to keep at it through the long days and years, required real strength of body and spirit, a resilience and endurance that we should recognise and respect. The workers of the age bore their hard lot with a fortitude born of necessity, enduring what had to be endured, and there is real admiration due to them for this, for the strength with which they met their hard labour. Their endurance was a quiet heroism. The third thing to honour is the skill and the pride that many of these workers brought to their trades, for even the humblest and grimmest of jobs often required real skill, and many workers took a genuine pride in their craft. The tanner's craft, the dyer's art, the skilled trades that required real knowledge and ability were performed by workers who had mastered their crafts and who took pride in their skill. Even the humblest labourers often brought care and skill to their work, a pride in doing it well, and this too deserves our recognition, the craftsmanship and the pride that dignified even the grimmest of trades. There was skill and pride in the work, and dignity in that. To honour the workers of the Tudor age, then, is to recognise the necessity and value of their work, the endurance and resilience with which they did it, and the skill and pride they brought to it, seeing in these humble and grim labours not merely misery, but real dignity. They were not simply victims of a hard age, but people who did necessary work with fortitude and skill, who kept their world running through their toil, who deserve our respect as well as our sympathy. As we remember the worst jobs of the Tudor age, let us honour the people who did them, the ordinary workers whose hard labour, grim as it was essential and dignified. Let that respectful reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to reflect on the comfort and ease of our own working lives. Having honoured the hard labour of the Tudor workers, we may find ourselves reflecting on our own working lives, and feeling, perhaps, a quiet and unaccustomed gratitude for the comfort and safety and ease that we so easily take for granted. For the contrast between the work of the Tudor age and our own is vast, and reflecting on it can give us a deeper appreciation of how much has changed and how fortunate we are in the conditions of our labour. Consider the transformation wrought by machines, for we now have the mechanical power that the Tudor world entirely lacked, engines and devices that do the heavy and unpleasant work that once fell upon human muscle. The lifting and hauling and digging that once broke the backs of workers is now done by machines, the hardest physical labour taken over by mechanical power, sparing human beings the worst of the toil. This transformation has eased the burden of work beyond anything the Tudor worker could have imagined, removing so much of the physical hardship that once defined labour. The machines have lifted from our shoulders the crushing physical burden that the Tudor worker had to bear. Consider, too, the transformation in safety, for we now have the knowledge and the measures to protect workers from the dangers that the Tudor worker faced unprotected. There are safety regulations and protective equipment, knowledge of hazards and means of avoiding them, protections that guard the worker from the dangers of the work. The miner, the sailor, the worker in the dangerous trades are now protected in ways the Tudor worker could not have dreamed of, the hazards of the work reduced and managed rather than simply endured. This transformation in safety has made work vastly less dangerous, sparing workers the perils that the Tudor worker faced as a matter of course. The dangers that once maimed and killed are now guarded against. Consider the transformation in the conditions and rights of work, for we now have reasonable hours and conditions, protections and rights, a whole framework that guards the worker's well-being in ways utterly unknown to the Tudor age. There are limits on hours, standards for conditions, rights and protections for workers, a recognition that the worker's well-being matters and must be safeguarded. The Tudor worker had none of this, labouring long hours in poor conditions with no rights and no protections, and the transformation to our own age is immense. The framework of rights and protections that now surrounds work would have seemed an impossible luxury to the Tudor worker. To reflect on all this is to feel a proper gratitude for the conditions of our own working lives, the machines that spare us the hardest labour, the safety that guards us from the dangers, the rights and protections that safeguard our well-being, all brought into focus by the contrast with the hard world of Tudor work. We may complain of our work, and often with reason, but we are fortunate beyond the imagining of the Tudor worker, spared the physical hardship and the danger, and the utter lack of protection that they endured. To remember their hard labour is to appreciate our own easier lot, to feel gratitude for the great transformation that has so eased the burden of work. Let that grateful reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the human beings behind all these jobs, the people of the age. As we near the end of our journey, it is worth pausing to reflect on a curious and rather poignant truth about so many of the jobs we have explored tonight, that they have vanished entirely from the world, disappeared so completely that most of them are now scarcely remembered, gone the way of the world that created them. For the grim and humble trades of the Tudor age have, for the most part, passed away, and there is something worth contemplating in their disappearance. Many of the jobs we have considered simply no longer exist, made obsolete by the great changes that have transformed the world of work since the Tudor age. The gong farmer vanished with the coming of modern sanitation. The fuller and the dyer were transformed beyond recognition by the mechanization of the cloth industry. The leech collector faded with the changes in medicine. The turnspit disappeared with the coming of new ways of cooking. One by one, the grim and humble trades of the age were rendered obsolete, swept away by the transformations of the centuries, until they vanished from the world entirely. The jobs that once occupied so many are now simply gone. The disappearance of these jobs was, in most cases, a genuine improvement, for the vanishing of the grimmest trades meant the end of the hardship and unpleasantness they involved, a real advance in the conditions of human life. The gong farmer's job vanished because sanitation improved. The dangerous and unpleasant trades faded because better ways were found. The disappearance of these jobs reflected the easing of the hardships they embodied. There is, then, cause for satisfaction in their vanishing, for it meant the end of much hard and grim and dangerous labour, a genuine improvement in the human lot. The jobs vanished because the world grew kinder to its workers. And yet there is something poignant too in the disappearance of these old trades, for they were once the whole world of work for countless people, the means by which they lived and the crafts in which they took pride. And now they are forgotten, gone as if they had never been. The skills that were once carefully learned, the trades that once defined lives, the crafts that were passed down through generations, have vanished utterly, remembered now only as curiosities. There is a certain melancholy in this, in the complete disappearance of these once essential trades, the forgetting of the work that once filled so many lives. The vanished jobs take with them a whole world of skill and labour and human effort. To reflect on the vanished jobs is to be reminded of how completely the world of work can change, how the trades that seem essential in one age can vanish entirely in another, how the whole texture of working life is transformed over the centuries. The grim and humble jobs of the Tudor age, once the daily reality for countless people, have passed away, most of them for the better, all of them now scarcely remembered. In recalling them tonight, we have brought them briefly back to mind, these vanished trades and the people who did them, honouring for a moment the forgotten labour of a vanished world. Let that reflection on the vanished jobs settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the human beings who did all this work, the people behind the jobs. As our journey draws toward its close, let us turn from the jobs themselves to the human beings who did them, for behind every trade and labour we have explored were real people, with their own lives and hopes and struggles, as human as ourselves, and it is in remembering them as people that we find the deepest meaning in our journey through the worst jobs of the age. Think of the ordinary people who did these hard and humble jobs, rising each day to their difficult labor, enduring the hardship and the unpleasantness, getting on with the work that had to be done. They were not merely functions or roles, but living people, with families and feelings, with their own small joys and sorrows, who happened to make their living through these hard trades. The gong farmer and the tanner, the scullion and the laundress, the miner and the sailor, were real human beings, living their lives as best they could, and it is right to remember them as such, as people, rather than merely as workers. Behind every grim job was a human life. Think of the families that these workers supported through their hard labor. For most of them worked not merely for themselves, but to feed and shelter those they loved, their hard toil the means by which their families survived. The grim jobs were done, very often out of love and duty, to provide for wives and husbands and children, to keep families fed and housed, and there is something moving in this, in the hard labor undertaken for the sake of loved ones. The workers bore their difficult trades not merely for themselves, but for their families, their toil an act of provision and care. Behind the hard work was often the love of a family. Think of the dignity and the humanity that these workers retained, even in the hardest and grimmest of jobs, for they were not diminished by their humble labor, but remained full human beings, with all the worth and dignity that belongs to every person. However grim their work, however humble their station, they were people of full human worth, deserving of respect and recognition, their dignity undiminished by the hardness of their trades. It is important to remember this, that the workers in the worst of jobs were not lesser beings but full human beings, equal in worth to any, their humanity intact through all their hard labor. The grimness of the job did not diminish the dignity of the person. In remembering the people behind the jobs, we move beyond the mere cataloguing of trades to a deeper and more sympathetic understanding, seeing in the workers of the Tudor age not curiosities or functions but fellow human beings, with their own lives and loves and dignity, who did the hard work of their world with fortitude and for the sake of those they loved. They deserve this recognition, this seeing of them as people, and in giving it, we honor not merely their labor, but their humanity, the full human worth of those who did the worst jobs of the age. Behind every job was a person, and it is the people whom we finally remember. Let that human recognition settle gently in the dark. We turn now to our final gentle thought, the thread that connects us to them across the years. As our long night draws toward its close, let us hold one final gentle thought, a thought that reaches across all the centuries between the workers of the Tudor age and ourselves, and finds in the end a deep and human connection. For all the difference between their hard labor and our own working lives, the workers of that age were, at bottom, human beings just like us, and in contemplating their jobs, we are contemplating something of our own shared humanity across the years. The need to work which shaped the lives of the Tudor workers is one that we share, for we too must labor to live. We too spend our days in work. We too know the necessity that drives people to their jobs. However different our work from theirs, the fundamental fact of working for our living connects us to them, the shared human experience of labor, of spending our days in the tasks by which we survive. We are workers as they were workers, engaged in the same fundamental human activity of labor, and this connects us across all the difference of the centuries. The need to work is a thread that binds all the working generations together, and the deeper things that lay behind their work, the providing for families, the taking of pride in a job well done, the enduring of hardship for the sake of survival and those they loved, are things we understand and share, the human meanings of work that persist across all the ages. The Tudor worker laboring to feed a family, taking pride in a craft, enduring hardship out of necessity and love, was doing what workers have always done, what we ourselves do, and in these shared meanings of work we recognize our kinship with them. The human heart of work, the love and pride and endurance that lie behind it, connects us to the workers of every age. We share not merely the fact of work, but its human meanings. There is something steadying and gentle in this thought, this sense of connection across the centuries to the people who labored in those hard trades so long ago. They are gone now, every one of them, the gong farmers and the tanners, the scullions and the sailors, all the workers who filled that vanished world, their hard labour long since ended, their trades long since vanished, all of them now at rest. But they were here, they lived, they laboured and provided and endured, and we are connected to them by the long thread of our shared humanity, the common human experience of work that runs back through the Tudor age and far beyond. To remember them is to feel our kinship with the whole long procession of working humanity. And so we can let them rest now, the workers of that distant age, with a kind of tenderness and gratitude, a recognition of our shared humanity and our debt to them across the years. Their jobs were hard and often grim, their labour difficult, and their trades now vanished. But they were human beings like ourselves, working to live and to provide and to endure, and their toil helped to build the world from which our own has grown. Let that gentle sense of connection settle over you now, warm and quiet, as we prepare at last to let the whole long story go and drift away into sleep. Let it carry you gently toward rest, this thought of the long human family of workers of which you are a part, stretching back through the Tudor age and far beyond. We turn now, at last, towards sleep. So let it all go now, gently, the whole long world we have wandered through tonight, the entire hard and humble and human world of Tudor work. Let it fade, the way the past fades, the way the years dissolve into a soft and shapeless distance. The tanneries and the kitchens, the mines and the ships, the markets and the great houses, all the grim and humble trades and the people who did them, all growing dim and quiet and far away, until there is only the warm dark, and your own slow breathing, and the gathering tide of sleep. Let the workshops grow quiet, and the fires die down, the tools set aside, the labour of the day finally done. Let the gong farmer and the tanner, the scullion and the sailor, the miner and the laundress, all lay down their hard labour and rest, their day's work over, their toil at an end. Let the whole great world of Tudor work, all the hard and humble trades and all the people who laboured at them, drift gently away into the deep dark of the past, all of them long at rest now, all of them beyond all labour and all hardship, at peace. They are gone now, every one of them, their hard work long since ended, their trades long since vanished, generations upon generations at rest, and there is a great soft quiet, where all their labour once was. Let them rest, and now, at last, so can you. Feel the warmth of your bed, soft and safe around you. Feel the weight of the blanket, gentle upon you. Feel how there is nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be. No hard labour awaiting you, no grim task to perform, no toil to endure, only the soft dark and the deep quiet and the simple comfort of rest. Feel your breathing slow and your shoulders soften, and the small cares of the day loosen their grip, one by one, and drift away into the dark like tools laid down at the end of the day, until there is only you, and the warmth, and the deep and rising quiet. And feel, perhaps, a quiet gratitude as you lie there, safe and comfortable in your own time, for the ease and safety of your own life, for a world in which the hardest labour is done by machines, in which work is safer and gentler than it ever was in that hard age. You may rest now, free from the grim toil of that vanished world, spared the hard labour that those workers endured, in a life made easier by all the long changes of the centuries. There is nothing to fear and nothing to endure. only the soft surrender to sleep, the gentle sinking down into the warm and shapeless dark, where all is quiet and all is well. The whole long story we have travelled, the whole hard world of Tudor work, can simply be set down now and released, dissolving into the warm dark, leaving you weightless and at peace, drifting gently down into sleep. And if any last image still lingers at the edge of your thoughts, some glowing workshop, some busy kitchen, some figure at their humble labour, let it grow soft now, and slow, and distant, the way a story fades as you slip past its edge into sleep, the images dimming, the sounds receding, the whole long world of Tudor work dissolving quietly into the warm and shapeless dark. You can simply let it drift away, like the day itself, like the past itself, out into the quiet and gone. Good night, traveller. The old hard trades are long vanished, all their labour long since ended, all their workers long at rest, and you are safe and warm and well. And so, at last, you may rest too. Rest easy, sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.